Welcome, guys. You hear me okay? All right. I know it's Greek week. Was the chariot race yesterday or today? All right. Who won? All right. What was today's big event? All right. Who won dodgeball? Okay. So is it anybody's game at this point, or is there one fraternity that's way out ahead? Are you sure? Are you just saying that? All right. Zach, how's Theta Chi doing? How's Theta Chi doing? You don't know. All right. I guess you're not winning then, because if you're winning, you'd know. All right. Well, thanks for being here, guys. So today is the 160th anniversary of something. Anybody know what it is? Yeah, Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox. Our guest is not going to talk about that unless he chooses to, but I thought it would be a good opportunity just to ask the question, okay, that's a significant event in American history. Why study war? Why study its effects? Why might that be part of a good citizen's education? Why might that be worth weaving into your liberal arts education? So I'm grateful that Aaron MacLean is joining us. I'll give you the short version of his biography. Some of you, here, this will be a good test. Raise your hand if you've listened to School of War podcast at some point. All right, so a few guys. All right, you could have politely raised your hands, but I appreciate you sticking to the honor code on that one. So a few guys might know him from that. But he's also, his day job, he says, is the senior director of the Paul Singer Foundation. He's also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, host of the School of War podcast. He served as senior foreign policy advisor and legislative director to Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Served on active duty as a U.S. Marine for 7 years, deploying to Afghanistan as an infantry officer in 2009 and 10. Following his time in the operating forces, he was assigned to the faculty at the U.S. Naval Academy, where he was the 2013 recipient of the APGAR Award for Excellence in Teaching. He received a BA in Philosophy and the History of Math and Science from St. John's College in Annapolis. Also studied and received his doctorate in medieval Arabic thought from University of Oxford. He's been a Boren Scholar, a Marshall Scholar. He lives in Virginia, where he was born. So in terms of just kind of a citizen soldier, educated citizen with a deep liberal arts background, I ask you to join me in welcoming Aaron MacLean.
All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here at Hampden-Sydney. It was an MPhil, not a PhD. I mean, no, but I don't want to do the stolen valor thing where I let that go. It was a good story. My supervisor, I considered doing a DPhil, and I started the project. And Bruce will appreciate this story. He was a German, and I don't know if you guys know about German academics, but it's very hierarchical. And the supervisor is the boss, and you are the subordinate as the student. He assigned me my PhD project, which was going to be the creation of this critical edition of an Arabic, a very long, very boring work of Islamic philosophy that I had no particular interest in whatsoever. And I diligently went down to the British Library for about 3 months to sort of start laying the groundwork for this project, and ultimately concluded that I just couldn't do this for the next several years of my life. It just was not what I wanted to do. And I came to him with this whole alternative proposal that had I executed it, it would have constituted the most minor contribution you might imagine to like the history of philosophy and the history of Islamic philosophy. And this guy sort of leans back in his chair and says, yeah, Aaron, I don't think you're at the point in your career where you want to be seeking paradigm shifts in the field. And at that moment, I knew that program was probably not exactly the right one for me. But it's an honor to be here at Hampden-Sydney. It's fun to take on this topic. And what I'm going to do, I'm not going to speak for too long, maybe 20, 25 minutes or so at most, just to prime the pump. And then I'm hoping we can spend the bulk of our time going back and forth. And you guys can ask questions about anything you want, really, or offer your own commentary based on things that I say on our theme tonight, which is why study war. And I'm particularly grateful to have the opportunity to talk about this because it occurred to me that I've never actually given systematic thought to the question. The podcast project, which I've been doing for a few years now, began on the premise that it would be valuable to study war, but I'd never actually sat down and worked out what are the elements of the value of the study of war. So I'm gonna give you 3 reasons tonight for why you should study war, and we'll get to that in just a second. But can we start? And we'll start with some audience participation here. What is war? What are we discussing tonight? What do you guys think? Yes, sir.
On conflicts or so involving multiple states or actors within a state.
Multiple states or actors within a state. So right up until actors within a state, I thought we were sort of crisp and clean, and then you introduced actors within a state, which seems to no, it's not an attack. It's just I'm emphasizing that once you say that, it's like, well, wait, what does that even mean? So because there's this funny thing about war, right? Is it's actually a little bit hard. So if it's an actor within a state, so the U.S. versus the Taliban in like 2009, is that a war? I see nodding heads. The U.S. versus a cartel, is that a war? I see nodding heads. I see some equivocation. 2 cartels fighting each other, nodding heads. Parts of a cartel fighting each other. I'll keep going. Eventually, I'll start losing people. The point is, it's going to be hard to draw a firm line. There's this violent phenomenon, right, of the clash of wills, and when you have 2 states clashing, using violence, that's the sort of paradigmatic case that we can all agree is war. And then there's all kinds of subsets and variations which get harder and harder to wrap your head around. But sticking with that sort of set of general parameters, why study it? Let me before I get to my 3 answers, I'll offer a couple reasons why people don't study war or why you might not want to study war. One argument would run something like there's something sinister to studying war, to being a serious military analyst. Why would that be sinister? Well, do we think war is a good thing or a bad thing? Bad. I could sign up for that. It's a strong case to be made that wars should be avoided and generally have lots of bad consequences. Okay, well, if we think that war is bad, then probably we think that war should be avoided. And if we think that war should be avoided, the study of war seems as though it might play into all kinds of state-driven initiatives to fight war. So why would we want to contribute to that? Why would you want to contribute to the ability of a state to fight a war?
As the saying goes, those who refuse to learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
I think that's a very sound argument, but the phenomenon that I am describing, you might be surprised, is actually like pretty alive and well, and has, I think, a role to play in the pretty precipitous decline of the serious study of military history on campus. It's quite hard, I mean, especially the more elite the school, to study military history as an undergraduate and to find tenured faculty who this is what they do. If you want to study, the plight of this or that group in war, or how war affected the social fabric of something, or war and things, war and economics, war and culture, that's pretty straightforward, and you'll be able to find that at a lot of places. If you want to study the operational history of the Revolutionary War, good luck. Hampden-Sydney, apparently it's possible. I'm telling you right now, it's not as easy in a lot of places. And part of what's behind that is this ethic that there is something a little sinister or concerning about the study of war. There's something about it that will distract us from the pursuit of peace and the pursuit of a better world. I'm not persuaded by the argument. I'm with you. But the argument, or at least a kind of emotion that constitutes a kind of argument, is certainly out there. Another reason that might be more at home in a room like this is maybe it's not necessary. Here we are. It's been a couple years since things wrapped up in Afghanistan, and by the end there, it was a pretty small-scale affair as far as the American role was concerned. It's been a even longer since the war was really raging in Afghanistan or Iraq, and even those wars were smaller in scale than some in American history, certainly some in world history. They're so small, in fact, that they could be fought by an all-volunteer force, which is what the U.S. military has today and has had since the 70s. Our wars are on a scale that basically you only fight if you choose to fight. So if you are, a nice young person out thinking about your life and your career, and it's not part of your career ambitions to join the military, Well, it's sort of a big case of somebody else's problem. And we also are here in America. And in America, we like to fight wars, or have for a very long time, like to fight wars other places, ideally across the ocean. It is indeed the 160th anniversary of the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, but that was 160 years ago. That's a pretty long time, right? So something about the study of war to some people seems kind of sinister, and to other people, perhaps reasonably on some level, seems unnecessary. A lot of time and effort for something that may not ever affect you directly. Which leads me to my three reasons that I'm going to walk you through and tell a couple of stories, and then I'll open it up to you guys. And you guys ask me about war or whatever's on your mind. The first reason concerns you guys as young people. A reason you may want to study war is that you may have to fight one. You, personally, sitting here today. I regret to report that your age group is pretty well positioned for a lot of the scenarios that those of us who work in national security policy in D.C. are worried about. Many people are worried about the serious prospect of a direct clash with China in the Western Pacific. The conventional wisdom holds that clash is more likely to happen sooner rather than later, which is to say in this decade rather than the next decade. There's all kinds of interesting debate about that and good arguments on both sides, and obviously all involved would prefer to deter the war rather than fight it. But if it were to occur, it would, of course, be the first direct clash of major powers and nuclear armed powers since 1945. The all-volunteer force may not be able to sustain the kinds of demands that such a conflict would require. There are also a lot of interesting conversations and discussions underway in these sort of national security communities about the new role and importance of mass on the battlefield. We've gotten to the point where, as a country, for part of the American war, to have all these really expensive, really exquisite pieces of technology that are also really expensive. And when you lose them, very hard, very expensive, and take a long time to replace. Platforms like, F-35s and aircraft carriers and things like that. And the battlefield may actually require cheaper things in greater quantity to secure and hold terrain. So the good news for you is some of that cheaper stuff is things like cheap drones. The bad news for you is, who wants to take a stab at what the oldest and most traditional form of cheap mass on the battlefield is?
A person with a weapon.
Infantry. A person with a weapon is a great definition. Infantry. Traditionally speaking, it is people about your age when things kick off that get the call for that. I was talking to a young man, talking to a college student at a different institution about his career plans the other day, and he told me he's very interested in national security and wants to sort of study foreign affairs and come into DC and do that kind of thing. But he told me I have no interest in joining the military. And I couldn't help myself but responding, well, the military may have an interest in joining you. You just never really know these days. And things that are 50 or so years old are not eternal. The all-volunteer force is not eternal. And you could imagine national scenarios and national crises where it suddenly went away very quickly. In which case, it would behoove you to know the kinds of things that make for a successful, you guys are college students, so successful military leaders, military officers in advance. Things like what it takes to not just be physically fit yourself, but train a unit to be physically fit. Train young people to be resilient yourself. Have some insight into physical courage and what it requires, and how to communicate that, and how to train and lead others in that regard. Have some insight into the hardest part of all of this, because it speaks beyond your own immediate needs and interests, but to leadership and command, which is you take all of that other stuff that I just listed, and then you add the need to make decisions, good decisions, under stress, in the face of great uncertainty, in time-limited environments that are quite chaotic. How do you flourish at that? How do you succeed at that? What are the principles of that? These are the sorts of things that the study of war will start to give you insight to. Obviously, hard military training, realistic training is necessary as well, but being a student is a big part of that, and you can learn a lot of valuable stuff now through the study of war. So that's my first reason. Reason number one, it's worth studying war because you may have to fight in one. And I think that's more true today than it has been at any point since the end of the Cold War. I think the world is more dangerous today than it has been since the 1980s. And I include the immediate post 9/11 era in that statement. It's reason number one. Reason number two is you are all mostly, I presume, citizens of the United States. Some of you may have a few other passports as well, but you're citizens. This is a democracy. So you share in the government. Maybe only at the most limited level in that you're going to exercise your civic duty to vote. Well, that vote matters for affairs of war and peace. Presumably you are selecting between political alternatives that have outlined platforms that take different positions on, should we fight or not fight in this or that scenario? And if a war were to start, how we should fight, what our strategy should be. Congressmen, senators, national politicians certainly really owe you their views on these questions. And you, at a minimum, need to be able to adjudicate between them. Some of you, I suspect, in a room like this, will run for office one day or seek positions of public responsibility. Maybe you want to be appointed in administration or something like that one day. And maybe you'll find yourself elected at a time when national security considerations are real, or find yourself appointed to offices with national security responsibilities. It seems to me that the serious study of war would be very valuable in all of these circumstances, and frankly, kind of incumbent on us as citizens at the most basic level, because as an American democracy, it is our democracy that will fight the war, and is ultimately with our democracy that the ultimate decision-making resides. And we have a position in the world that's been pretty consistent since 1945, despite all of the debates about it, to include very much at the present day. We can talk about that. There is a pretty consistent American grand strategy since 1945, certainly since the end of the Cold War. To maintain a presence in the Eurasian littorals, and to prevent any hostile power or coalition of hostile powers from achieving hegemony on either end of Eurasia. That's been our goal for a very long time. Is that the right thing to do? Is it the wrong thing to do? What's required? How expensive is that? Should we do it? Does it put us more at risk than it keeps us safe? Is the assumption that this is the plan that actually keeps us safe a true assumption? These are all foundational questions of public policy. I regret to report that we could use more study of them in Washington, frankly, at a level of first principle, because it seems to me, I by the way, make the case for the grand strategy that I just sketched very, very quickly for you. But it strikes me that a lot of people who at least believe in it enough to execute it have fallen out of the habit of explaining it from first principles. And you end up seeing a lot of debates in Washington that sort of take the form of bumper stickers clashing with each other. That we need American leadership or the rules-based international order, for example, on the one hand, or we need to focus on our problems at home and ignore all these other people are free riding on the other hand. And those two are, neither of those, frankly, is a particularly serious argument. They're both, I would characterize both those as bumper stickers more than arguments. So it's incumbent upon you as citizens to make a study of these things. All right, it's my second reason. So reason number one was, as young people, you may have to fight in one. And reason number two is that as citizens, you have some level of responsibility to have a view of these questions, because it may suddenly matter a great deal to all of you as voters, but maybe even to a couple of you as potentially people in positions of influence, political influence, one day. My third reason, which will involve a few stories, is the study of war, whether you're going to do it mostly through books or whether you're going to combine books and practical application like I and some others in the room have done, will teach you things about being human that it is harder to learn about than in other walks of life. It will teach you, for example, that there are such immaterial things as courage. I believe that passionately. When you see somebody run across an open field under fire purely out of commitment to another human being, heedless of their own safety, you have to conclude that there's got to be a name for that, and that things that you can't see or touch necessarily are real and deserve names. This is not just the world of material things. And it might cause you to start to ask questions about the nature of courage or what drives it or what it is. The moment that I had that I asked such questions, I was a rifle platoon commander in the Marine Corps, my very first day of combat in Afghanistan. This is January of 2010. And we were told that we were going to patrol out into this area close to a district that the Marine Corps was about to mount an enormous operation to seize from the Taliban. So the Taliban were kind of over there. We were over here, and we were going to go towards the area that the Taliban controlled. And we were told that we were meant to meet with local elders and engage them with tea and have conversations and learn about their grievances. Well, it became rapidly apparent that day and the few days that followed that there was no such tea to be drunk, that this was a effective no man's land, that the Taliban had a serious pre-planned defense for it, and if you walked that way, you're going to end up in a big gunfight. And that's indeed what happened on the first day. I ended up in an enormous gunfight with my platoon. It was, I remember, a few minutes into it, it was at such a scale, because the Taliban could mass a platoon-sized force as well, that I remember thinking, like, wow, this is pretty intense. Like, does it get more intense than this? There's like mortars going in both directions. They actually had a heavy machine gun. And somewhat miraculously, that day, none of my Marines got hurt, which in retrospect, I think we were mostly just very lucky. Because definitely all of the terrain we were on was mined. We just were lucky and either didn't step on them or we did step on them and they didn't go off. But something that happened right at the end of that firefight has always stuck with me, which was we in the end we're moving back to our position, because if we had kept going, we would have had to basically seize the area prematurely, and the Marine Corps didn't want us to do that. And just as we were close back to our position, we took some incoming small arms fire again. And you learn very quickly in these circumstances what is fire in the general vicinity, like people are shooting in the area, and what is fire which is somebody trying to shoot me. Like, what does it sound like for somebody to actually shoot at you? And you learn to tell the difference pretty quickly. This was definitely somebody shooting at us, at the immediate group of people and Marines that I was with. I did the very rational and reasonable thing under the circumstances, I thought, which was jump into a ditch. It was immediately next to me and take cover. And I pop up and I look, and I'm trying to find the source of the fire so that we can return fire and maneuver. And I hear from over my shoulder the voice of my platoon sergeant, crusty guy named Sergeant Bill Rupture. And I just hear him say, "He's over there, sir." I look up, and he not only did he not jump into the ditch with me, but he never even took cover. He was just standing there, and this was pretty accurate fire. He was just standing there, calmly looking down the sights of his weapon, identifying the source of the incoming fire. Which is the one of the things the movies are a bit misleading about. It's actually one of the hardest things in combat is figuring out what's happened. Who is where and who is shooting at whom and to what end. In the movies, it's always fairly straightforward to figure that out. Like in Black Hawk Down, when an RPG hits a truck, what do you see right before that in the movie? What's like the frame before that in the movie, inevitably?
Dude with an RPG.
A dude with an RPG, exactly right. Well, in real life, the kid driving the truck, what do you think he sees? Boom. He sees boom. Maybe he hears whoosh right before it. It's actually a real challenge. One of the primary challenges of combat, or certainly leadership in combat, is just orienting on the situation, figuring out who is where and doing what. And so there Bill was standing, figuring that out for me. And I've long reflected on that moment and his absolutely sort of ice-cold, cold-blooded reaction to what was a serious threat to his personal safety. And I had come to the conclusion that something that I had long believed, which was that courage primarily and in the first place was doing your job even though you were afraid, that the actual situation might be a little bit more complicated than that. I still think that that's an okay definition of courage, and a lot of us are stuck with it, and there's no shame in it if that's what courage is for you. I don't think Bill was actually scared. I actually don't think he was. I think anyone here read Aristotle, Nicomachean and Ethics? Set on the program here? A couple of hands? That's great. Courage is a virtue, right? And virtues are means, right? So that means that it's the happy middle ground between two extremes, right? And so courage is the middle ground between cowardice, obviously. Cowardice is being, in Aristotle's account, is being afraid of things that you ought not be afraid of. So, like kids are afraid of the dark. Grown-ups ought not be afraid of the dark. That's cowardly. You're afraid of something that you ought not be afraid of. Recklessness is the other extreme. Recklessness is not being afraid of things that you should be afraid of. So, irresponsible gamblers are not afraid of ruining their families' livelihoods. You should be afraid of ruining your family's livelihood. It's a really bad outcome. You'll be responsible for it. Don't do it. It should scare you, and you should not do it. And so the mean, of course, then courage is being appropriately afraid and not afraid for the things that matter and don't matter. And Aristotle has this kind of toss-off line that does not, I think, sit well with us moderns. That actually death is one of those things, properly speaking, that you shouldn't be afraid of. people, so when they study the book, they kind of pass that over quickly because it's uncomfortable for us to deal with. I think Bill wasn't afraid. And I think that in that moment, not literally in that moment, because I was thinking about other things, but reflecting on that moment in later years, I started to see Aristotle's account of things a little bit more, which is also a humbling experience because my heart rate was definitely up and I was quite concerned about not being shot. So there are immaterial things like courage. It's one of the things you might learn about the human experience from studying war. Another thing you might learn about the human experience is that individual decision-making and excellence in leadership matters. You are not necessarily trapped in the anonymous clash of vast forces. You might get unlucky and be caught up like that here and there. I'm not saying that every decision and every act of individual excellence is consequential to the world at all times. I am saying that there are times when it is, and you ought to be prepared for those times because you can matter. The crispest, most dramatic example of this from American history that I can think of is D-Day. Where has anyone been to Normandy? It's really, you guys are lucky, and the rest of you guys, I only went there for the first time a few years ago, actually. It's an incredibly powerful place, and it is unbelievable standing, in particular on Omaha Beach, which was the really bloody American beach. Utah, there was combat at Utah Beach too, but it was Omaha Beach. If you guys have seen Saving Private Ryan, that's Omaha Beach. That's where things really went bad for a bunch of the units that landed. And it turned into a brutal, brutal fight that we actually almost lost. We almost lost the Omaha Beach fight. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. When you think about what the elements of success were at Omaha Beach, you can't, at least it seems to me, avoid the conclusion that individual excellence, and by excellence I mean kind of the whole kit and caboodle, like the preparation, education, training, courage under fire, at every level, from the young small unit leaders and troops on the beach itself, all the way up to like literally the President of the United States, the Prime Minister, and King of England. Like the decision making at some point just aligned for everything in that operation ultimately to more or less succeed. Starting at the top, from the decision that the Americans and the Brits made right at the start of the American entry into the war to go after Europe first, the decisions that the Americans made, that Roosevelt made, even before the start of the war, to orient the American economy to a war-making economy that was going to create the stuff to include ultimately the landing craft and the planes and the ships that would achieve maritime and aerial dominance. There were preparatory steps for D-Day. Those were decisions made years before the fight and executed vigorously years before the fight to put those troops in a position where they were even acting in the strategic context where success could be determined. 2, Eisenhower. Eisenhower, of course, he was in this unusual position where his major responsibility, once the planning was complete, was to do one thing, and that was to decide go or no go. That was his responsibility. After that, for a period of time, it was going to be somewhat out of his hands. And what do you think was the most important factor for deciding go or no go? Don't overthink it. Weather. The weather. Then as now, weather is a factor in military operations, and even a bit more then, especially when it's an amphibious landing across a potentially choppy, dangerous body of water. And by the way, there's a huge aviation component to the operation as well, in terms of the airborne troops, but also close air support and things like that. You have to decide the weather, and you end up with Eisenhower in this amazing, it's an incredible story, which I'll only tell the brief summary of, where he rehearses this decision day after day after day. He has a dedicated weather decision-making team that he brings together day after day, and they look at what the weather is that day, and they act as though the next day is D-Day, and they decide under those circumstances what they would do or not do, whether it would be go or no go. And they do that for days and days and days just to get into the rhythm of what it will be like to make that decision. And then they're sitting there on June the 4th, we all remember it's June the 6th, right, is the invasion. Sitting there on June the 4th, 1944. And it's one of the most gorgeous English summer days in memory. And the meteorologist has to report to Eisenhower that the barometers, the readings they're getting from out in the Atlantic from places like Iceland and so forth, it's no go. It's no good. It's going to be bad weather tomorrow. You can't do it. And we have a problem, which is we only have basically the 5th and the 6th left, because after that there's going to be a gap, and the tides and other circumstances won't be right until basically mid-July for the landing. We're talking about trying to end the war here. We're talking about launching an operation that then will have to make it effectively all the way to Berlin for the war to end. So the more we push this thing to the right, the greater the human cost is. So no go on the 4th. On the 5th, they reconvene. It is, in fact, a stormy, miserable day. They come together, and this time, actually, the weather picture is not so clear. It's still going to be bad weather tomorrow. It's going to be bad weather on June the 6th. But as they sit down I think it's the sort of mid-afternoon, to make the decision, the final decision, the meteorologists basically believe, and there's some dissent, but the lead meteorologist, his theory of the case is that there will be a window. There will be a window that lasts just long enough, starting in the dark and getting you through the better part of the day, where you can execute the operation and achieve enough of a foothold ashore to make it feasible. Imagine being Dwight Eisenhower in that situation. You're telling me I got a window. What does that even mean? And by the way, this is not, weather forecasting like you can all pull out your phones now and actually see the green and the red on the screen and know exactly where the storm is. It's not like that. It's much more, it's not as precise as that. And he's being told by this person he's come to trust, but he has to make the decision that there will be a window. And if he decides not to go, which seems like the cautious and probably defensible under the circumstances decision, there'll be a real delay. There'll be a delay in victory in Europe. And of course, as you all know, he decides to go. And it does, in fact, turn out to be the right decision. And it turns out, ironically, that the next window also faced really bad weather. By the way, not that there's any way you could have known that in June. So they go. Then down to Omar Bradley, who's the commander of the American beaches. He's still afloat as the first, second waves are going ashore at places like Omaha and Utah Beach. Omaha Beach is going badly. We do not have access off the beach by several hours in. We are not breaking out in force off the beach, and you have units that are being wiped out, essentially before they can make it to the far terrain features. Is anyone here from Bedford or around Bedford, Virginia? No.
I know what you're talking about.
What happened to the young people of Bedford, Virginia?
That over around basically all the casualties. So Bedford actually lost the most guys in a single day.
That's right. Yeah, it's the 29th Infantry Division, so it's Virginia National Guard in part.
Yeah.
And
they even have little flyers. So I've put on the meet.
Yeah, I know it's the National D-Day Museum Monument is in Bedford, Virginia, which seems like kind of an odd thing, but it's because it is the highest per capita loss of young people in America in the Second World War. Because essentially this one landing craft, this one company, or portion of a company is wiped out right there on the beach in the morning in Omaha Beach. So Bradley's off there ashore, and there is actually a moment mid-morning where he seriously contemplates pulling the invasion at Omaha. At Omaha, he's going to keep Utah, where we have Americans successfully going ashore, and the Brits and Canadians are further east. And they're meeting with more success than we are with Omaha. Omaha Beach, which is one of the middle beaches in the beach complex. The battlefield's huge. It's an enormous battlefield. Omaha Beach exists only to connect Utah with the British beaches. That's the operational purpose of Omaha Beach, is to create that echelon in between. So if you lose Omaha, what that means is you'll have Americans over here and Brits and Canadians over here, with a lot of Germans in between. So does that mean that World War II is lost, if that's the circumstance at the end of the day on June the 6th? No, probably not. But it does mean that you are probably significantly postponing success in the Battle of Normandy, maybe even calling into question the long-run success of the Battle of Normandy in a way that feels uncomfortable. And it means that the war probably would not have ended in Europe in May of 1945. It means that you would have been pushing things well to the right. That's the weight of the decision on Omar Bradley as he sits there deciding whether or not to pull this thing or give it another wave. Give it another wave. Let's see if these guys can push out. All the way down to the guys who were there on the beach, the guys who were closer to your age. Joe Dawson is one of the famous young infantry unit leaders in this circumstance, who hours into the fight, you watch Saving Private Ryan, you get the impression this whole thing took about a half an hour. It took hours and hours and days, really, in a sense, of fighting. But he eventually, reading the terrain, the sort of complex micro terrain that was in front of him, figured out a route where he could creep up in what you would call in the infantry defile, basically in a place where the bad guys can't see you, to get close enough to start reducing the positions, and also realizing that their ammunition was starting to run low enough that it became feasible in a way that an hour earlier it was simply not feasible. So guys like Joe Dawson actually surviving, coordinating their troops, doing the work of figuring out who is shooting at whom and why, and what is their defensive scheme here actually, and does it match onto the metrics, onto the visuals that I studied before coming ashore here. And by the way, I'm in the wrong place on the beach anyway, so it doesn't really matter what I actually looked at on the map, because it's a whole different situation that's right in front of me. Just excellence at every level, to my point. And it took excellence and correct decisions. Trying your best didn't do it. Like, you actually had to get it right, and you had to do the preparatory work and have the judgment, and bring all the experience that at every level you had to bear to get to those correct answers in incredibly stressful, incredibly consequential circumstances. And you see that when you study war. You can see this. There are plenty of other walks of human life where you can face stressful, important decisions, of course. But in war, it's almost it's reduced down to its purest elements. So that's the second reason. You'll realize that individual excellence matters. My last story is, I think you'll also realize some things about politics. And one of the things you may realize about politics is the battlefield will show you that some of the things that we believe in our small L liberal society, and I use liberal in a neutral sense, as a descriptive sense of sort of Western society. Society believes in democracy and individual rights, thinks that on balance compassion is better than cruelty, the kind of world that we want our kids to live in, that I want my kids to live in. That the battlefield doesn't necessarily operate according to the same laws as the world that we want to live in operates according to, and that not everybody wants what we want. Not everybody actually thinks that the same things that the average American believes are important and valuable. The world is not necessarily full of people like that. My most vivid experience of realizing this was, to go back to my own Afghanistan experiences. We had those initial patrols, and then we fought a big battle to secure this district called Marja. And then I ended up, in effect, the mayor of sort of the better part of the southern third of Marja for several months. And there was this guy who lived in the area. His name was, or the name he went by, I should say, is Mubarak Shah. And he identified himself, essentially the week we arrived, as a senior Taliban official, whom he claimed he had no operational responsibility in the area. He was just basically a poppy titan. He owned all the poppy in one of the sub-areas of Marja. And he couldn't leave. These were his economic interests. And he basically said, you can arrest me now, or I can be a resource for you and speak to you whenever you want. And I'll report back on my conversations with you to Quetta, as I know you will report back on your conversations with me to your chain of command. And the powers that be, well senior to me, decided to take that deal, and they left him in place. And I was essentially the cop on his beat. So I would check in on him from time to time, which seemed like good policy, to take his temperature on how things were going. And one of these times I was sitting there, and we had these talking points that we were supposed to recite, to make the case for the counterinsurgency plan, that the government in Kabul was going to provide security and economic development, and those were good things, and he should get behind it. And I had a whole litany of arguments that I would make. And I kind of believed them, to be honest, at the time. I had not yet soured on them. And he had talking points he would use with me, too. We would kind of go back and forth. He would say things. He would sort of work me over as an American. He would say things like, I've never seen a bridge in Afghanistan stamped made in Pakistan or made in Iran. Like, I like Americans. You guys are generous, And so it was sort of a mutual, for me as a young guy, sort of a crash course in diplomacy and manipulation. One of these encounters, his 10-year-old son was there. Good-looking, 10-ish, good-looking kid, could follow the translator, so he could stand there and listen and follow the conversation. And sort of seized by inspiration in the course of one of our multiple rounds of debate, I said, this guy was an unusual guy, by the way, I should say for context. His dad had been in the Afghan parliament. He had been to university in Pakistan. This was all highly unusual. by the standards of the district. He was extremely well educated and wealthy by the standards of where we were. And I said, look, don't you want in 10 years your kid to go to university like you did and be a doctor or a lawyer and have a better life in Afghanistan that's free of war? You know, why not sign up for all of that? And he looked back at me and he had these slate gray eyes and he responded without missing a beat. In 10 years, my son will have died fighting in the jihad. With his kid standing right there. I don't actually remember how I responded. I may have turned the conversation to the weather. But I was unprepared for that answer. And I was fundamentally unprepared for the nature of politics in Marja. I truly believed when we showed up that we were going to remove the boot of the Taliban oppressor from the neck of the bedraggled and oppressed Afghan farmer, who would then rise up and seek all of the things that people naturally want. He would want to vote. He would want free access to markets. He would want all these things. He would want to surrender some of his rights to the sovereign, which would then protect them in a social contract, because this was what I had been educated, but also what I had lived. This was life, and I grew up in Fairfax County, Virginia. It's it's a nice place, you know? There's no war in Fairfax County, Virginia. It's not even that much crime. It's a nice place to grow up. That was not what life was like in Marja. There had been a war in this part of the world since the end of the 1970s. And frankly, even before that, things didn't work exactly this way. It was a brutal struggle for survival between what were essentially armed criminal gangs, of which the Taliban was one factor among many, not even, depending on the day and the circumstances, the most significant factor. And I got a real political education from those experiences, which can also be gotten or received through study. So my three reasons for why you might study war. One, as young people, you might find yourself fighting in one. Two, as citizens, you have a responsibility to act as citizens, which is to say to govern in some way. And some of you may end up governing in some more substantial way. And it is entirely possible that will involve matters of war and peace. And you ought to have some basic understanding of the critical issues there and what the correct views are on them. And three, in again, a kind of concentrated, reduced fashion, you may learn things about humanity that you don't learn growing up where I grew up. You just don't learn them. Life isn't hard enough to learn them. I'm going to conclude with this. It is correct. I did not come to talk about the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. But the fact that it's the anniversary inspired me to look up some Civil War facts. I basically drove through the Civil War from D.C. to get here. So you drive through all the major, one of the major theaters of war down the way. I looked it up. Surrender happened here 160 years ago today, just a few miles away. Over the course of that war, 620,000 Americans, if you count both North and South, died in the line of duty, were killed in the war. The war was 1,500 or so days long, give or take, a couple days, which works out to 400 or 500 men a day dying in the war. That's a lot. But of course, you got to keep in mind that the population of the United States at the time was about 32 million people. So if you do a little back of the envelope math about what that would look like today, I'm a philosophy guy, not a math guy, so these are all quick estimates that I did on my phone calculator. You're talking about more than 6 million dead if the Civil War were to be fought today, which would work out to 4,000 people dead a day, which is to say more than 9/11 every single day. And I said earlier, one of the reasons why you might not study war is because it doesn't seem necessary. And okay, we're right close to Appomattox Courthouse, but that was 160 years ago. Okay, well, another simple math thought. 160 is just 80 times 2, right? So that's 2 lifetimes. It's 2 lifetimes ago. You go back one human lifetime, you start another one, you're in the middle of the Civil War. They're fighting right here. It's not that long ago. It's practically yesterday in the terms of human history. So with that, I'm happy to take your questions and keep talking, and thanks for your attention. Sure.
All right. So on one of your episodes of the podcast, I can't remember which, you brought up the Thucydides trap in relation to the Taiwan scenario.
Yeah.
Right. I'm dumb and I still don't understand what exactly that meant. I know about Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War and all that. Could you please enlighten me?
Yeah. So the Thucydides trap is the invention of a academic scholar, writer, traveler named Graham Allison, and the theory is it's a sort of a political science theory that what started the Peloponnesian War is something that starts a lot of wars, which is a status quo power confronting a rising power, and the fear of the status quo power that the rising power is going to seize its position sort of starts the war. So in the Thucydides case, that is Sparta as the established power, fearing that Athens, as the rising power, is going to attempt universal hegemony in Greece and basically bump Sparta aside. And that fear drives the war. And Allison's argument is that the United States' fear of the rise of China is going to start a war between the United States and China. That is the Thucydides trap. I think it's mostly nonsense, to be quite honest with you. Thucydides is not nonsense. If you are interested in war and you want to study war, you should absolutely read Thucydides. Ideally, you read it with somebody who has some experience of reading it, or read it in a group, because it can be a bit of a slog to just work your way from start to finish solo, though I commend you if you attempt it. It is a rich, powerful, wise book that actually is full of very complicated views about war and what starts wars and how wars proceed that are much more nuanced than Graham Allison's view. Because if you just accept Graham Allison's view as a given, you would conclude that, well, obviously we don't want the war, so what that means is we should be less afraid and we should accommodate China. It's like the fear of the trap prescribes that policy. It's like, okay, well, what does that mean exactly? And the more you think about it, the more it starts to lead to some pretty unpleasant things. Does that mean we have spheres of influence? And what are the implications of that for American grand strategy? At some point, are they accommodatable? I don't think that's actually the word, but you know what I mean. Some powers are. Some political entities exist to be appeased. My family's in part Scottish, and the part of Scotland I'm from was the scene of many Viking raids and occupations over the years. You know, itinerant raiders, as often as not, can be bought off and sent away. They can be appeased. Adolf Hitler couldn't be appeased. It's about what their worldview is and what they want. Do they want hegemony? Do they want control of the world? It's a question you have to have an answer to, because before you embark upon a policy of accommodation, you have to decide if it's actually going to succeed. So, sorry, that was that included both my account of what the Thucydides trap is and the reasons why I think it's bunk, which I'm not sure that's what you were asking for. So that's my best stab at it. Yes, sir.
Overall, what personal wars or areas of history do you personally like to study?
Yeah, I mean, I'm obsessed with the Second World War personally, and that's really for personal reasons. I mean, I could make a case for it. I mean, it is terror and suffering and chaos on the grandest scale in human history, essentially. Victor Davis Hanson, who wrote a very, very good book about the war, has an amazing introduction to the book where he sort of lists he takes statistics that people who specialize in this no doubt know, but presents them in all sorts of interesting ways to just emphasize just the vast scale of the suffering and the carnage of that war. So I could make a case for it being, as the Peloponnesian War was to the Greeks, it should be to us as the object of study to understand war. For me, it's personal because my dad fought in it, and it's very unusual. It helps me when I made my what I hope was a slightly dramatic point about how the Civil War wasn't that long ago. It's easier for me. I sort of intuit that because I realize it sounds crazy. I'm not that old to have someone whose dad, not grandfather, but father, fought in the war. But that's just always been my life. It's always been a bit strange. I showed up very late in his life, and he was basically a kid when he was 17 when he went off to recruit training. And so when I was 5 years old, my worldview basically was that there had been this really bad guy named Adolf Hitler, and he had tried to take over the world and kill all the Jews. And my dad stopped him. And there were other guys there, like Uncle Jack was there, and Uncle Jim was there. These are all real people, by the way. But it was mostly my dad. And like I got older, and this view sort of acquired nuance. But the kernel of it remained, because there is a kernel of it that was true and can be said of anyone who served honorably in that war. And so I remain utterly fascinated by it. I read about it. I have the privilege of helping to lead a World War II staff ride program. So we go to battlefields. We've only done Europe. I can't quite justify the per head cost of the Pacific yet, but I'm going to figure out how one day. That's my personal answer to it. I mean, you guys, where you are, I mean, where I live too. I mean, the Civil War is all around us. It's all around us, and civil wars are savage. They are savage because of their intimacy. But World War II for me. Yes, sir.
What's your favorite World War II movie and TV show?
TV show, there's no contest. It's Band of Brothers. It really is excellent. And it's funny, I was just talking to someone about this on the way down here, because there's a Marine equivalent to Band of Brothers called the Pacific, which is, it's good. Okay, well, I'm glad you say that. I like it. It's a good show, and obviously as a Marine, I feel like I should prefer the Pacific. I just can't. I can't bring myself to do it because, and it's purely for like literary reasons, essentially, that I think Spielberg and Hanks made the right decision in Band of Brothers to focus on one company. So you see the war from the point of view of a relatively small group of people compared to the scale of the thing. Whereas the Pacific, like, I know these stories. I know who John Basilone is. I know who Chesty Puller is. I basically know what happened at Guadalcanal, kind of more or less what happened at Guadalcanal and so forth. But like, we're skipping around episode after episode from island to island and regiment to regiment, and I'm like losing track. I'm like, wait, what island are we on here? Which Marines are these? It's sort of complicated. But to me, it's no contest. Band of Brothers. The movie's a lot harder. I mean, there's some phenomenal World War II. I don't, frankly, I think it's an unfair question. I don't know if I can answer you. I will say the best recent movie I've seen that's a World War II movie is Tom Hanks's Greyhound. Phenomenal movie. And it never, like, it was released, I think, during the pandemic on Apple, and then it just kind of disappeared. You can't even get it on, not that you guys, I'm old, but you can't get it on 4K even. You have to buy it on Apple. It's one of the best depictions of command I've ever seen on film. So it's the story of this guy played by Tom Hanks, who is an American naval officer whose career has been kind of on the rocks. But the war starts, so he gets a command at sea and goes off to command a ship escorting a convoy across the Atlantic in the Battle of the North Atlantic. And there are a bunch of British ships in the escort as well, but because of the nature of naval tradition, even though he has no combat experience, he is the senior captain of the group, so he is in command of the escort. And then they enter the window in the middle of the North Atlantic where they are essentially free of friendly air cover. And it's just it's a savage duel between them and a group of U-boats. And you study, I mean, you watch this man as he confronts all of his own demons and doubts about himself, and tries to keep all these ships afloat in the midst of murder. And it's brilliant. It's totally brilliant. It's probably not the best World War. If I gave it some thought, I could come up with a bunch of competitors, but that's the best recent one. Yes, sir.
Some historians have argued that World War I and World War II are the same war with a 20-year gap in the middle, same players, same sides, very similar goals, similar players, similar sides, similar goals. Would you support or argue against that?
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation. I mean, there's something to be said for it, certainly in Europe. I mean, what you lack in World War I is the Pacific. World War II is global, truly global, in a way that World War I is not. World War I is kind of global, like the 7 Years' War was global. Like, there is stuff going on in a lot of different places. But in World War I, the main action is there in Europe. I mean, look, World War I, I think actually as Americans, I made this point to the group I was having dinner with. Forgive me for repeating myself, but I think as Americans, we underrate World War I in a way that Europeans do not. For Americans, World War II is the defining event of the 20th century and really of modern American history, or the history of American foreign affairs. It is the pivot point of American history in terms of America in the world. And World War I might have been that, but it wasn't in the end. We came home. We sort of as a country decided that we weren't too happy with what had just happened. We weren't totally comfortable with the reasons we had just fought or the costs we had just paid. And we stayed home. That was not the case after World War II. We made some very different decisions. And also, of course, World War II for America was a much larger scale affair where we lost more people and spent a lot more money and mobilized the society to an even greater extent than we did in World War I. For the Europeans, at the college at Oxford, where I was a postgraduate student, you walk into this little arcade outside of the chapel, and the first thing you see to your left is this sort of panel. It's about the size of this plaque behind me, panel of names, and it's the Balliol dead of World War II. And it's several dozen names. I mean, it's a lot of Balliol men. It's not a huge college. Probably about the size of Hampden-Sydney, actually, died. So a couple of dozen people dying in the war is a big deal. But then you're looking down this arcade that's another, I don't know, 20-ish feet in front of you, and it's sort of gloomy and dark, and you can't really make it out. And you realize on both sides of the arcade, all the way down from top to foot level, are the names of the World War I dead of Balliol College, where the class is matriculating in, 1912, 13, 14, 15. They just died. They're just gone, with a handful of exceptions. For Europe, World War I marks an end of an old order that was savagely destroyed, but then the new order didn't really coalesce. The problems didn't really resolve, and it took World War II and the reactions out of World War I that were then faced down in World War II, and then the American involvement in World War II to introduce a new order that then stuck. It stuck in the form of a bipolar order and a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then only the U.S. was left standing after another couple generations. So it's a fun, parlor conversation, and I'm for those. There's a case for it. Yes, sir.
It seems like this day and age, diplomacy kind of ran supreme. Would you say that understanding diplomacy and political science is more advantageous to modern day than just warfare?
That's a great question. I'm going to set aside the political science piece for a second because I'm skeptical of the social sciences broadly. But diplomacy, I could make the same case for diplomacy that I could make for war. I mean, my podcast is about war, not diplomacy, so we could go find a diplomat to make a more detailed case. But it's just as important to understand diplomacy as it is to understand war. And I would go further and suggest that understanding just the one and not the other is a bit ridiculous. And this is where the fetishization of diplomacy, or we have to try diplomacy, sort of bothers me. Diplomacy is an act of statecraft that only makes sense when the threat of war or the possibility of armed force is present. It's not a binary thing. You conduct your diplomacy ideally from a position of strength, which is generated from military capacity. And by the way, your military activities have to be directed to some sort of political end that is coherent and achievable. So your military activities are occurring, in other words, in a diplomatic context. So they are two sides of the same coin as the cliche, but it seems to apply here. My assigned topic was why study war, but I strongly believe in the case for studying diplomacy as well, for a lot of the same reasons. Yes, sir.
So, you mentioned at the beginning kind of American grand strategy post World War II, and then how that looks like it's changing a little bit in Washington. I consider myself pretty staunch internationalist, but going back to talking about the Civil War and how that's not long ago, it wasn't long ago that we were a pretty staunch isolationist country. So, what's your argument against, this kind of shift back to isolationism being just returning to a cold, seemingly effective foreign policy that lasted a good first half of American cases?
It's a great question. It's an urgent question, really, because there really is a kind of, especially on the right, a relitigation of a lot of these things right now. And I mean, before I'll give you an answer, but just briefly, I mean, let me explain. It was disorienting to come to Washington as a Republican with internationalist views, and suddenly discover that my party was rapidly diversified, let's just say, in its views on that question. Because I was born in the '80s, so I was born into Ronald Reagan's Republican Party, where the Republican Party was the party of, the military strength and American dominance and all these sorts of things. And it was the left that was I'm oversimplifying, obviously, but it was the left that was on the other side of those debates. And so all of a sudden to hear Republicans using a lot of the rhetoric that I had heard from the left during the Iraq and Afghanistan, we have to end endless wars, all this kind of stuff. All of a sudden these are on the right. And it was disorienting. And I remember my first response was confusion. I'm like, what is going on here? And I came to conclude something, which is that actually what was happening was not actually that strange or revolutionary, but rather just sort of a reversion to the natural mode of the right, which is to say that America is again a liberal country. Liberal countries are going to have liberal foreign policies. They're going to have foreign policies that take into account liberal principles. And to be on the right is, on some definitional level, to be skeptical of liberalism. So it's only natural that you would be skeptical of liberal foreign policies. It follows. And in fact, that was the natural place of the Republican Party for a good chunk of its history, not all of its history, but if you go back to the post-World War I era that we were just discussing, President Harding, to an extent President Hoover, the kinds of ideas that are fresh and new again were quite prevalent, and it takes a series of, if you will, external shocks to bring the American right into a place where it not only accepts the consensus, but at various points even leads the consensus for American internationalism. And by external shocks, I mean like Pearl Harbor. And not even Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor doesn't really end the America First movement. It's Hitler's declaration of war a few days later that ends the America First movement. There is a multi-day period where the option that we might just fight Japan and leave the Europeans defend for them, or leave the Brits defend for themselves, that's alive and well in the debate for several more days. And then, post-war, it's the blockade of Berlin. It's the invasion of South Korea. It's the Cold War itself that keeps Republicans more or less internationalist. And even then, it's not straightforward. I mean, the party's nominee in 1952 was almost Robert Taft, an isolationist leader. And it was also easier in those days because isolationists were we used the words we used the actual words in those days, whereas today it's sort of impolite to use these words. People would call themselves isolationists back in the day, and other people would call themselves interventionists. It was helpful in the Cold War that the Cold War had a left-wing villain. If the Soviet Union had been a right-wing villain, I think you would have seen it played out very differently on the right. But it was helpful to keep the right on side, that the bad guys were on the left. And then, in the 90s, when I was growing up, you saw a lot of the same conversations that we have today sort of bubbling up. You saw a lot of skepticism about intervention in the former Yugoslavia. You saw Patrick Buchanan play a very prominent role in the party, ultimately not the nominee, but a voice, and a prominent voice in the party. And then what happened? 9/11. So it's these series of shocks, right, that galvanize things. And it's been 24 years since 9/11. And you see things returning, I think, to actually what is their natural place. And my actual answer to your question, just very briefly, because I'm actually not sure how much time we have, but my actual answer to your question is we end up in this very unfortunate place in this debate in Washington where you have people making the case for American internationalism who I actually think have sort of forgotten some of the hard geopolitical reasons for the case. The hard geopolitical reasons I alluded to earlier. If a hostile power or coalition of powers were able to consolidate control of Eurasia, or even just one of the two poles of Eurasia, that would pose a threat to the American way of life that would be extremely serious. Imagine Eurasia actually controlled in total by the Soviet Union, or controlled by Nazi Germany at the one end and Imperial Japan at the other, or today controlled by the Chinese Communist Party in some kind of tenuous coalition with satrapies in the form of Russia and Iran. I could detail it, but I think that's a pretty concerning situation for us. That's the hard geopolitical case. Instead, the case tends to get made in terms of almost moralistic terms. We have this rules-based order, and we have to follow the rules, and the world is a just and better place because of these rules, and we have to act in a 21st century way. Don't act in a 19th century way, act in a 21st century way. It's America's responsibility to uphold it, and you sort of try to say this to the average voter, and they quite rightly are like, what the heck are you talking about? Like, I didn't sign up for any of that. I got some major concerns on the home front, and you seem to me to be talking nonsense. And then this generates on the right this kind of reaction that thinks of itself as realist. You guys are talking fairy idealist nonsense. We're going to talk real talk. We're going to talk about how the world actually works. And by the way, part of the reason why you might study war is because you will get a realistic dose of how the world actually works. So there's something to be said for the realist impulse, but it has a tendency to overdo it and to end in this place where it almost sort of fetishizes the hardness of the world and how we need to be tough. And the world is really just a bunch of gangsters being gangsters to one another. And that's just how it is. And that's how we ought to be accordingly. And I think that poses some real problems for American foreign policy and Americans. And frankly, more importantly and more dangerously than that, it tends to then counsel a policy of isolationism or policies that approach on a spectrum isolationism, an openness to spheres of influence. Well, real spheres of influence, if the other spheres are controlled by hostile powers, violates my rule that I already laid out, which is we don't want hostile powers controlling Eurasia. And so there are practical reasons. There are practical geopolitical hard power American interest reasons to basically pursue the grand strategy we pursued since 1945. We've sort of forgotten how to make the case. How much time do we have, sir?
Let's go 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. All right. Yes, sir.
Oh, do you think the timetable for like Chinese invasion of Taiwan is sped up at any? Because yesterday in class, the think tank guy said it was like in 6 months is what he's thinking.
Really? Well, I saw. Yeah, there's been
Ports and building facilities are for an age.
Yeah, I've seen some chatter on that. I don't have access to anything classified, but there has been sort of a bunch of chatter. Which think tank guy? Do you remember his name? Oh yeah. All right. Yeah, I've seen some reports in the last few days. I'm not really in a position to evaluate them. I mean, the conventional wisdom has been for some time that it is the late 2020s, which we are about in. Is the window of maximum danger, because that is the period where the Chinese, so the argument goes, will have a maximally favorable balance of power in the Western Pacific. As you move further to the right, it is possible, if we do the right thing, that we can equalize that in some ways. And also they have some real demographic challenges, long-run demographic challenges that are quite concerning for them. So the conventional wisdom, which is often wrong, is that the real dangerous time is now, and that things will get relatively safer as time goes on. I don't know if that's true or not. Some very smart people that I think are well-read and interesting believe it. Xi Jinping really wants Taiwan, and we need to take that seriously, and we need to take what it could mean for us seriously. I remember in the lead up to Russia's the reinvasion of Ukraine in 2022, there was all this debate in the winter of 2021, 2022 about like what are they doing? What are the Russians doing? Like, can't they see this is just going to be a quagmire? Like, what is their goal here? What's their plan? I remember having this conversation, and a Senate colleague of mine piped up in the middle of one of these interminable debates, and he said, "What if their goal is Ukraine? What if they just want Ukraine? What if there's actually not much more to it?" And Putin wrote in 2021, I believe, this long essay that I read, so you don't have to, sort of interminable semi-revisionist account of Russian history about how Ukraine is Russia. There is no such thing as Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. For Xi and for the Chinese Communist Party, just to take a step back, the existence of Taiwan is a real problem. The existence of a Chinese statelet, that is a successful, thriving democracy, as an example to its people, it's right there. It's about as far away as Normandy is from Britain. That's a problem, and they've never really militarily been in a position to do anything about it until quite recently, and now they are. And it's not straightforward. I mean, we talked a little bit about D-Day earlier. Imagine trying to do D-Day without air superiority or without maritime superiority. That's a pretty tall order. So it's complicated. And then you get into these questions of will there be blockades and how do you deal with that? But it should be keeping us up at night. It's a real threat. And we also shouldn't be focused monomaniacally on it. I mean, we are running close to, somebody getting killed in the South China Sea in these clashes you see, for example, between the Philippines and China on a daily, practically, basis. Things could get real dangerous real quick in any number of different scenarios. It is a genuinely dangerous world right now in a way that even 5 years ago, it would seem markedly less tense. One last question. Yes, sir.
So earlier you said you were skeptical of the social sciences. How come?
This is the last one. All right. Well, the next 2 hours. That's tough as a last question. I think I'll be as brief as I humanly can here. The subjects of the social sciences are of urgent importance. The effort to reduce everything this is not universal, but one often encounters in the social sciences an effort to reduce things to mathematical models and then make predictions from these models about the future, I find that suspect in the study of human affairs. And could at greater length expound on that, but I will spare you or spare your peers that at the moment. And guys, this has been a great conversation, and I've appreciated your attention and your interest and your questions. So thank you very, very much.